The world snapped into slow motion. The sounds of the community, fair, the laughter, the music, the cheerful chatter all compressed into a dull, distant roar, like hearing a war through a concrete wall. The only thing in sharp focus was my wife, Sarah, on the ground. She'd been shoved from the community stage, a hard, brutal push that sent her stumbling off the edge and onto the hard-packed grass below. I was moving before she even landed, the years of training kicking in, my brain instantly shifting from husband to medic. I dropped to my knees beside her, my hands already assessing, my voice a low, calm anchor in the sea of chaos. "Sarah, look at me. Can you hear me?" Her eyes were wide, dazed, a flicker of pain behind the shock. She cradled her left wrist, and I could already see the unnatural angle, the rapid swelling, fractured. My fingers went to her neck, checking for spinal injury, then gently palpated her skull, feeling for the telltale signs of a serious head injury. "Pupils are equal and reactive," I murmured, more to myself than to her. "No sign of cranial bleeding, but I'm watching for delayed symptoms of a TBI." My mind was a checklist, a cold, clinical triage protocol that had been hammered into my soul by years of chaos and violence. This was my world, assessing damage, mitigating threats, and preparing for what comes next. And the threat was still standing right there. A few feet away, the man who had pushed her stood flanked by two other goons in cheap, ill-fitting polo shirts, with the words, "Vance Premier Security," badly embroidered on the chest. He was thick-necked and arrogant, a common bully who'd been given a uniform and a license to be cruel. And behind him, watching with the cold, regal disapproval of a queen observing a peasant squabble, was the woman who had given the order, Eleanor Vance. The iron-fisted president of our HOA, a woman who ruled our neighborhood like her own private fiefdom. There was no remorse on her face. No, shock. Just a thin-lipped satisfaction, the look of a person who had successfully silenced a dissenting voice. This wasn't some back-alley brawl. This was a public execution of an idea, carried out on the body of my wife. We were at the annual Willow Creek Community Fair. Sarah, a respected ER doctor in this town, had been on stage for 5 minutes, giving a passionate presentation about a healing garden she was trying to build for local veterans suffering from PTSD. Eleanor Vance, who considered the garden's natural design an aesthetic violation, had ordered her security to remove Sarah from the stage. And they had, violently. I looked from my wife's pain-filled face to the smug indifference on Eleanor's. The stakes were laid bare in that single, horrifying moment. This wasn't just an assault. It was a message, sent in the most public way imaginable. Defy me, and you will be hurt. My training is about saving lives, about mitigating damage. But there's another part of that training, the part they don't talk about at community fairs. It's about eliminating the threat so the rescue can happen. As I gently splinted Sarah's wrist with a rolled-up magazine and a strip of cloth from a nearby vendor's table, the medic in my head was finishing his assessment. But another voice, one that was colder, harder, and far more dangerous, was just beginning its own. Eleanor and her hired thug thought they had just assaulted a doctor. They were about to find out they had just activated a pararescueman. We have a saying, "These things we do, that others may live." It's a sacred creed. But sometimes, it also means making damn sure the guilty wish they hadn't. Eleanor Vance saw a doctor on the ground and her angry husband. She couldn't see the ghosts of a dozen blown-out helicopters, the screams of wounded men, or the cold, hard calm that settles in your soul when you are the only thing standing between a brother and his grave. Before I was a homeowner, before I was a husband, I was an Air Force Pararescueman, a PJ. For 15 years, my job was to go to the worst places on Earth, on the worst days of people's lives, and bring them home. Our motto is simple, that others may live. It's not a suggestion. It's a blood oath. I was a combat medic with a rifle, a guardian angel with a trauma kit, the man they sent in when the situation was already foobar. I've performed emergency surgery in the back of a C-130 flying through a thunderstorm and set bones in the middle of a firefight. You learn to compartmentalize. One part of your brain is laying down, suppressing fire, while the other is calculating morphine dosages and applying a tourniquet. Chaos is the baseline. Your job is to impose order on it, one saved life at a time. I remember a night in the Korangal Valley, Afghanistan. A Black Hawk, carrying a squad of Rangers, went down hard on a ridge, right in the middle of an enemy hornet's nest. We dropped in under a hail of RPG fire, the night lit up by tracers. I was the first man on the ground at the crash site. The scene was pure hell. Wreckage, fire, and the screams of the wounded. My training took over. I wasn't a man anymore. I was a machine built for one purpose: triage. I moved from soldier to soldier, my hands working automatically. Assessing, stabilizing, making the impossible choices you have to make when you have 10 critical patients and only 2 hands. I had to perform a needle decompression on a ranger with a collapsed lung while using my own body to shield him from ricochets. All around me was the roar of battle, but in my head, there was only a cold, quiet checklist. We didn't lose a single man that night. I brought all of them home. That's the authority I carry. It wasn't granted by a committee, and it can't be taken away by one. When I retired, I thought I had left that world behind. I married Sarah, the brilliant, compassionate ER doctor who understood the ghosts I carried because she fought her own every day. We were a good team. I used to bring men back from the battlefield. She put them back together in the emergency room. We moved to Willow Creek because it was supposed to be quiet, a place to finally find the peace that had been missing from our lives. We built a reputation as pillars of the community's health and safety. But the skills you learn in a war zone never really leave you. They just go dormant, waiting for a new mission. 2 years ago, there was a multi-car pileup on the interstate just outside of town. I was one of the first on the scene, 5 minutes before the first ambulance arrived. It was chaos. Smoke, screaming, panicked people running everywhere. My training kicked in. I wasn't Alex, the quiet veteran from down the street, anymore. I was back on the bird. I established a casualty collection point, performed triage on a half-dozen victims, and directed bystanders to apply pressure to wounds. I pulled a woman from a minivan who had a severe arterial bleed in her leg. I applied a makeshift tourniquet using my belt and a tire iron, an action that the paramedics later said saved her life. The fire chief, a good man named Dave Haskins, arrived on the scene to find me running it like a battlefield medic. He told me later, "I got there, and you had already done half our job for us. You didn't just help. You took command. You were the calmest person in a hurricane of chaos." That's my hidden expertise. The ability to see through the chaos, identify the primary threat, and apply precise, controlled pressure until the bleeding stops. The same skills you use to save a life are the ones you use to dismantle a corrupt organization. And our current fight with Eleanor Vance, it wasn't just a personal dispute. It was a mission. Sarah, in her work as an ER doctor, had seen too many local veterans come in, not with physical wounds, but with the invisible scars of PTSD. She decided to do something about it. She designed a healing garden, a therapeutic space to be, built on a corner of our property, filled with sensory plants and quiet, secluded seating areas where these vets could find a moment of peace. It was a beautiful, selfless project, designed with input from PTSD specialists. It was her way of bringing them home. Eleanor Vance and her architectural review committee saw it differently. They didn't see a sanctuary. They saw a violation. The garden's natural, non-uniform design, they claimed, was a breach of the community's aesthetic standards. She called it a morbid reminder of conflict that was inappropriate for a luxury community and detrimental to our property values. Sarah fought her for months, presenting at every HOA meeting, pleading her case. The attack at the fair was Eleanor's answer. It happened right after Sarah had given a passionate speech, appealing directly to the community for their support to override Eleanor's veto. The public humiliation and physical assault was Eleanor's way of showing everyone what happens when you challenge the Queen. She had made it clear. She would hurt anyone who stood in the way of her perfect, sterile world. She thought she was fighting my wife over a few flower beds. She had no idea she had just picked a fight with a man whose entire life was about going into hostile territory to bring his people home. The mission had just begun. The first rule of any operation is to know your enemy. You map their territory, you identify their strengths, and you find their weaknesses. And Eleanor Vance wasn't just a petty tyrant. She was the queen of a meticulously constructed kingdom called Willow Creek Estates. Her power didn't come from a fraudulent business scheme or a complex conspiracy. It was simpler, older, and in some ways more absolute. Her power came from her name, her money, and her unshakable belief in her own superior taste. She was an old money widow who ran the neighborhood's architectural review committee like her own personal fiefdom, a weapon she used to enforce. A set of draconian aesthetic standards that were as arbitrary as they were cruel. Her arrogance wasn't just a personality flaw, it was a worldview. She genuinely believed that her vision of a perfect, sterile, and utterly uniform community was a noble cause, and anyone who dared to introduce a hint of individuality was not just a violator, but a heretic. Her reign of terror was legendary, a collection of whispered horror stories traded between neighbors. I started asking questions, and the stories I heard painted a picture of a woman engaged in a long-running campaign of aesthetic terrorism. She forced the Peterson family, who were new to the neighborhood, to repaint their house 3 separate times, at a cost of nearly $30,000, because the shade of white they had chosen was, in her words, too warm and lacked the appropriate alabaster undertones. She fined them weekly, then had the HOA's lawyer put a lien on their house until they finally capitulated and used the exact paint swatch she provided. Then there were the Garzas, a young couple with 2 small children. They were sued into selling their home after they installed a child's playset in their backyard. The lawsuit wasn't about safety or noise. Eleanor's official complaint, which I read myself, stated that the playset's bright primary colors constituted a visual blight that disrupted the neighborhood's muted, earth tone palette. She destroyed a family's finances and forced them from their home because she didn't like the color red. Her power wasn't just based on the HOA's bylaws. It was amplified by a corrupt alliance with the head of the city planning department, a weak, deferential man named Abernathy. Every appeal filed against Eleanor's committee was mysteriously lost or denied by Abernathy's office for minor procedural errors. In return, Eleanor's Family Foundation made a significant charitable donation to the City Parks Department, which Abernathy just happened to control. It was a clean, simple loop of influence peddling that made her authority absolute. She was the unelected, untouchable queen of Willow Creek, and Sarah's healing garden was an act of rebellion she could not tolerate. The campaign against the garden was a personal vendetta from the start. It began the moment Sarah submitted the proposal. Eleanor and her committee formally denied it, calling the garden an unstructured and emotionally morbid installation in their official rejection letter. When Sarah, undeterred, decided to start building it on our own property anyway, the official harassment began. Daily violation notices started appearing in our mailbox, citing us for unapproved landscaping, unauthorized soil disruption, and my personal favorite, failure to maintain aesthetic conformity. The fines piled up, thousands of dollars in penalties for daring to plant a garden for wounded veterans. When the paper barrage didn't stop us, she escalated. One morning, we woke up to find the newly tilled beds of the garden covered in a thick, white crust. Bags of industrial-grade salt had been poured over the soil in the dead of night, rendering it sterile and useless for months. There was no proof, no cameras that caught them in the act, but we knew. It was a cruel, silent act of sabotage, a clear message that she would destroy the garden before she ever allowed it to grow. The public assault at the community fair wasn't a spontaneous act of rage. It was the culmination of this escalating campaign. Sarah's speech, her direct appeal to the community for support, was a threat to Eleanor's absolute authority. And so, she had Sarah physically removed, an act of public punishment designed to show everyone what happens when you dare to challenge the Queen. I got a copy of the official police report from the assault. I wasn't looking for the narrative. I was looking for names. And there it was, listed under the witnesses divided by parties involved section. The name of the security company Eleanor had hired. Vance, Premier Security. The name was a coincidence, but the connection was not. A quick search of the state's business registry confirmed it. The sole proprietor of Vance Premier Security was Eleanor's nephew, a man with a string of failed businesses and a reputation for being a violent, entitled bully. She didn't just hire goons, she hired family. She thought that would keep them loyal, that it would insulate her from the crime, creating a layer of plausible deniability. She had no idea she had just made a critical, tactical error. She had just handed me a direct, traceable line to the rotten foundation of her entire operation. The mission just got a new primary target. My war wasn't with a petty HOA queen anymore. It was with the unlicensed, uninsured army she had hired to enforce her will. Eleanor Vance was the head of the snake, but her nephew's fraudulent security company was the fangs. And I was about to dismantle it, not with force, but with the one thing these kinds of brutish operators never see coming: the rule book. My entire career as a PJ was built on a foundation of meticulously followed procedures and regulations. In a combat rescue, skipping a single step on a checklist can mean the difference between life and death. I was about to apply that same ruthless precision to Eleanor Vance's corrupt little empire. My home office became a command center. The mission: to conduct a full operational audit of Vance Premier Security and expose it as the criminal enterprise it was. I started with the basics, the digital paper trail. A quick search on the state's public business registry database brought up Vance Premier Security, LLC. The first red flag was immediate and glaring. Their business license had expired 6 months ago. They were operating illegally. That was a good start, but it was a simple misdemeanor, a financial slap on the wrist. I needed more. I needed to prove not just negligence, but a pattern of deliberate, criminal disregard for public safety. My next stop was the state's Division of Professional Licensing, the government body that regulates and certifies private security firms. I spent hours cross-referencing their database, and what I found was a goldmine of malfeasance. Vance Premier Security had no active company-wide security agency license. The state required one for any company with more than 3 employees providing security services. They had a dozen. Furthermore, I searched the names of the 3 goons from the police report, including the one who had assaulted Sarah. None of them possessed an individual security officer license, a legal requirement for anyone carrying a weapon or performing crowd control duties in the state. They had no formal training certifications, no background checks on file, and most importantly, they had no liability insurance. Legally, they weren't a security company. They were just a gang of thugs Eleanor's nephew had put in matching polo shirts and given a veneer of legitimacy. Every contract they signed was fraudulent. Every action they took was illegal. And every person who hired them, namely Eleanor Vance and the Willow Creek Estates HOA, was now exposed to a level of catastrophic liability that could bankrupt them 10 times over. But I didn't stop there. Local and state violations were one thing, but I knew that operators this sloppy and this arrogant rarely confined their negligence to just one area. My time in the service taught me that every branch of the government has its own set of rules, its own pressure points. So I widened the search. I logged onto the public database for the Federal Occupational Safety and Health Administration, OSHA. It's a clunky, archaic system, but it is a vast and searchable library of workplace complaints. I typed in Vance Premier Security, and the screen lit up. There were over a dozen complaints filed against them in the last 2 years, all from former employees. It was a horrifying pattern of abuse and negligence. Complaint #78A. Failure to provide basic first aid and trauma care training. Complaint #Height2C. Lack of certified personal protective equipment for crowd control events. Complaint #91F. Employee sustained a concussion during a training exercise where the instructor was intoxicated. Complaint #95B. Failure to provide functioning communications equipment, resulting in an officer being isolated and assaulted. And the most damning one of all. Complaint #03A. Wrongful termination of an employee for reporting illegal activity to the authorities. Each complaint was a screaming red flag, a testament to a company that was not just unprofessional, but a danger to its own employees and the public. But the most shocking part was the resolution for every single case. Dismissed for lack of evidence. Dismissed due to procedural error. Dismissed after complainant withdrew. It was impossible. A pattern like this didn't just happen. It was a clear sign of a cover-up, of a fix being in somewhere high up the chain. It was a direct link to Eleanor's corrupt political influence. Abernathy, her man in the city planning department, must have been making calls, burying the complaints to protect her nephew's criminal operation. I spent the rest of the night meticulously building my weapon. I printed every page, the expired business license, the state regulations on private security, with the sections they violated highlighted in yellow. The screenshots of the OSHA complaints, each one a story of negligence. I compiled it all into a single devastating report, complete with a cover page, regulatory and compliance analysis, Vance Premier Security, and the Willow Creek Estates, HOA. I didn't write it with emotion. I wrote it like an official after-action report, a cold, clinical dissection of a failed operation. It wasn't just a collection of facts. It was a legal bomb, primed and ready to detonate. Eleanor Vance thought her only vulnerability was a civil lawsuit. She was preparing for a drawn-out battle of expensive lawyers. She was expecting a fight she understood, a war of attrition she thought her money could win. But I wasn't going to sue her. Not yet. That was a civilian tactic. I was going to use the full, crushing weight of state and federal regulatory power to have her entire operation condemned. The next HOA meeting was in 2 days. It was time to deliver my report. Understood. I will now write Section 5, Confrontation, Escalation, adhering to the 2,500 word count for this part. Section 5, Confrontation, Escalation. The AOA meeting was Eleanor Vance's home turf, her royal court. It was held in a stuffy, wood-paneled community center that smelled of lemon polish and quiet desperation. Her board members, a collection of wealthy, compliant sycophants, were arranged at a long table at the front, with Eleanor seated in the center like a queen on her throne. She was in her element, the master of a universe she had created, and she was about to deliver a masterclass in narrative warfare. After the drivel of the meeting's minutes and the treasurer's report, she stood, her expression a perfect blend of sorrow and strength. She addressed what she called the unfortunate incident at the community fair. She spoke of a disruptive and emotionally hysterical Sarah Carter and praised the professional restraint of her fully licensed and insured security team who had acted to de-escalate a volatile situation. It was a breathtaking performance of gaslighting, designed to paint my wife as the villain and her goons as the heroes. The board members nodded along, their faces a mask of solemn agreement. They were all complicit, all part of the lie. She was about to move on to the next agenda item, a discussion about the approved color palette for mailbox posts, when I stood up from the back of the room. I hadn't come in with a group. I had slipped in alone and taken a seat in the last row. I didn't shout. I didn't raise my voice. I just stood there, and the room fell silent. Every eye turned to me. I was holding a stack of a dozen thick, professionally bound documents. With a calm, deliberate pace that felt louder than a scream in the tense silence, I walked down the center aisle. I didn't stop at the podium. I walked directly to the board's table, and, one by one, I placed a copy of my report in front of each of them, including Eleanor. Then, I turned to the first row of residents, handed out the remaining copies, and said, in a voice loud enough for everyone to hear, "Please pass these back." The room filled with the rustling of paper. At first, there was confusion. Then, I saw the exact moment the first board member, the treasurer, read the cover page, Regulatory and Compliance Analysis, Vance Premier Security, and the Willow Creek Estates, HOA. His eyes widened. He flipped the page, and his face went pale. He saw the copy of the company's expired business license. He flipped again and saw the state regulations they had violated. All down the table, the same wave of dawning horror was spreading. The whispers started, a low murmur that grew into a wave of panicked energy. They were no longer looking at Eleanor with adoration. They were looking at her with the terrified eyes of co-conspirators who were just realizing how badly they'd been betrayed. Eleanor, her face a thundercloud of rage, finally found her voice. "What is the meaning of this?" she demanded, her voice shaking with a fury she could no longer conceal. "This is a private meeting. Who do you think you are?" I turned from the crowd and faced her. My voice was calm, clinical, the same voice I used to use to deliver a medical assessment in the middle of a firefight. "I'm the man who is about to file a multi-million-dollar gross negligence lawsuit against this HOA, and every single board member, personally," I stated. The board members flinched, as if they'd been physically struck. "But that," I continued, "is just the appetizer. I have also submitted this full report to the Federal Occupational Safety and Health Administration and the state's Professional Licensing Board. Your fully licensed and insured security firm is, in fact, an illegal, uninsured, and criminally negligent entity." I let that sink in, then delivered the final, devastating blow. By hiring them, this board has willfully exposed every single homeowner in this community to catastrophic financial liability. So, to answer your question, Eleanor, I'm not just the victim's husband. I'm the expert witness for the federal and state prosecution that is about to dismantle your entire kingdom. The room exploded. The treasurer, a man who had been her loyal lapdog for years, shot to his feet, holding up my report like it was a piece of poison. "Is this true, Eleanor?" he shouted. "Did you hire an illegal firm with our money? Did you expose all of us to this?" The meeting dissolved into chaos. It wasn't a riot, it was a mutiny. The board was in open revolt, screaming at Eleanor, accusing her of lying to them, of destroying them. The residents, now armed with the truth, were on their feet, shouting questions, demanding answers. Eleanor Vance stood there, abandoned, her face a mask of disbelief. Her power, which she thought was absolute, had evaporated in the space of 5 minutes. It had been built on a foundation of lies and intimidation, and I had just demolished it with a stack of paper and the simple, brutal truth. Cornered and betrayed by her own people, her mask of civility finally burned away, revealing the raw, ugly venom beneath. Her eyes locked on me, ignoring the chaos around her. "You think this is over?" she hissed, her voice a low, dangerous whisper that only I could hear. "My nephew will handle you. You have no idea what his people are capable of." It was no longer the threat of an HOA president. It was the promise of a crime boss. She had just admitted that this was never about rules. It was about force. And she had just told me that the next attack wouldn't be with a clipboard. Eleanor's threat about her nephew was the last gasp of a dying queen. She was still thinking in terms of street-level thuggery, of physical intimidation. She couldn't comprehend that the war was already over, and she had lost. I wasn't preparing for a back-alley brawl. I was observing the controlled demolition of her entire corrupt infrastructure, a demolition I had set in motion. The report I had distributed at that meeting wasn't just a collection of facts. It was a series of synchronized, time-delayed charges, and they were all about to detonate. The first charge went off 2 days later. A team of 4 grim-faced OSHA inspectors with federal badges descended on the sad little office of Vance Premier Security. They didn't ask for permission. They presented a federal warrant for a wall-to-wall safety inspection. Eleanor's nephew, the incompetent bully she had empowered, found himself facing a team of seasoned federal investigators who were not impressed by his bluster. They went through his operation with a fine-toothed comb. They found a complete lack of safety protocols, non-existent training records, and faulty equipment. They discovered that his employees, the same men who had assaulted my wife, had never received even the most basic first aid or de-escalation training. The final report cited them for 24 serious violations, and the real killer, 3 willful violations, the kind of charges reserved for employers who demonstrate a conscious, deliberate disregard for the law and the safety of their employees. The fines weren't just punitive, they were catastrophic, a figure so high that the company was effectively bankrupt the moment the report was filed. The second charge detonated a week later at the state capitol. The state's professional licensing board held a formal hearing on my complaint. I attended, not as a witness, but as an observer. Eleanor's nephew showed up with a cheap lawyer and a bad attitude. He tried to argue that the violations were minor, administrative oversights. It didn't work. The board, armed with my report and the damning findings from the OSHA investigation, voted unanimously to permanently revoke his business charter. They didn't just shut him down. They opened a criminal investigation into him for fraud and operating an unlicensed security agency. In the space of 10 days, his entire illegal enterprise had been investigated, fined, and executed out of existence. With her private army dismantled, the third and most devastating charge landed directly on Eleanor and her board. I filed the multi-million-dollar gross negligence lawsuit. As I had predicted, the HOA's insurance carrier, having received a copy of my full report, sent them a scathing 10-page letter formally denying their claim. The letter, which my lawyer gleefully forwarded to me, cited their willful and malicious hiring of an unlicensed, uninsured, and criminally negligent contractor, and stated that their actions constituted a breach of their fiduciary duty that voided their policy. That was the kill shot. The legal shield that protected the board members' personal wealth was gone. They were now personally, and individually, on the hook for the millions of dollars my lawsuit was demanding. The mutiny that had begun at the HOA meeting became a full-blown rout. The board members, faced with the prospect of losing their homes and their fortunes, turned on Eleanor with a vengeance. In a desperate attempt to save themselves, they gave sworn affidavits to my lawyer, handing over years of internal emails and meeting minutes. The documents proved, unequivocally, that Eleanor had acted unilaterally, that she had been warned about the risks of hiring her nephew's company, and that she had pushed forward against the board's own counsel. They threw her under the bus to save themselves. The documents also implicated the corrupt city planning official, Abernathy. The local news, armed with these new leaks, ran an exposé that led to his immediate resignation and a city-level corruption investigation. Eleanor Vance was no longer a queen. She was an island, and the tide was coming in. Her nephew, his business in ruins and facing criminal charges, finally made good on his mother's threat. He showed up at my house one night, not with a team of goons, but alone, drunk and pathetic. He stood on the sidewalk, screaming obscenities, threatening to burn my house down to finish the job. It was a sad, desperate display from a man who had nothing left to lose. I didn't go outside. I didn't engage. I simply stood in my living room, my phone in my hand, and filmed the entire, unhinged tirade. When he finally lunged at my front gate, his fists flailing uselessly against the iron, I calmly said, loud enough for my phone's microphone to pick it up, "That's felony terroristic threatening. Add it to your list." Then I called 911. The same police force he had once tried to impersonate arrived and took him away in cuffs, a pathetic and fitting end to his career as a tough guy. The victory seemed total, but there was one loose end. A week later, my lawyer called. "They've surrendered," he said. "Eleanor knows she's beaten. She's agreed to a massive settlement, enough to bankrupt her to avoid a public trial. Her lawyers are drawing up the papers." It was over. But then he added, "There's one strange condition, Alex. She's insisting on a face-to-face meeting with you and Sarah. She says she wants to apologize in person." I was silent. An apology was the last thing I expected from a woman like Eleanor Vance. "It feels wrong," my lawyer continued. "It feels like a trap or some kind of final, desperate power play. We don't have to do it." I looked across the room at Sarah, who was sitting quietly, reading a book. I thought about the cold indifference on Eleanor's face as my wife lay bleeding on the grass. An apology wasn't what she wanted. What she wanted was one last chance to look us in the eye, to try and reclaim some shred of her shattered dominance. "I know," I said to my lawyer, "but we'll be there. Some missions you have to see through to the very end." The meeting was set on her terms, at her house. A final, pathetic attempt to control the battlefield. We walked up the long, stone pathway to her mansion, a cold, opulent museum that screamed of wealth but had none of the warmth of a home. She was waiting for us in her formal living room, a place so sterile and perfectly arranged that it looked like no one had ever actually lived in it. She was impeccably dressed, her posture rigid, but the ironclad confidence was gone. She looked small, diminished, a queen presiding over the ruins of her own kingdom. Her lawyers stood awkwardly in the corner. This wasn't a negotiation. It was a surrender ceremony. Her apology was exactly what I expected. It wasn't genuine. It was a legal maneuver. She read from a prepared statement, her voice a stiff, formal monotone. "I regret the unfortunate series of misunderstandings that led to the incident at the community fair," she read, her eyes fixed on a point on the wall somewhere behind us. "I offer my apologies for any distress this may have caused." It was a non-apology, a coward's statement crafted by lawyers to admit no real guilt while fulfilling the terms of the settlement. She was trying to win one last, tiny victory, to deny us the satisfaction of her genuine remorse. She finished and looked at us, a flicker of her old, defiant arrogance in her eyes. I didn't say a word. I just stared at her. But Sarah, who had been quiet and composed at my side, finally spoke. Her voice wasn't angry. It was calm, clear, and carried the undeniable weight of a doctor delivering a fatal diagnosis. "Your apology is meaningless, Eleanor," she said simply. "You didn't just break my wrist. You tried to break a community. You attacked a place of healing, a sanctuary for people who have been through far worse than you can possibly imagine, all because their search for peace didn't fit your aesthetic. Your money can't fix that. The only thing that can is for people like you to have no more power. In that moment, the last of Eleanor Vance's power evaporated. She had been morally and finally defeated. The victory after that was total. The massive settlement forced Eleanor to sell her mansion and all its contents to pay the damages. She left the neighborhood in disgrace, a pariah who had lost her fortune, her reputation, and her kingdom. Her nephew, thanks to my testimony and the video I had filmed, was convicted of felony threats and served a year in county jail. The HOA, with its leadership shattered and its finances in ruins from the lawsuit, was completely restructured. The old board was gone, replaced by a new group of actual residents who understood that an HOA was supposed to serve the community, not rule it. Their first official act was to not only unanimously approve Sarah's healing garden, but to issue a formal, public apology and contribute a substantial portion of their reserve funds to its completion. 6 months later, the garden opened. The ceremony was on a bright, sunny afternoon. The space was beautiful. A quiet, natural sanctuary filled with the scent of lavender and sage. The entire community was there, a testament to the peace we had all fought for. The fire chief, Dave Haskins, stood at a small podium and unveiled a simple, bronze plaque. He read the inscription aloud. "This garden is dedicated to Dr. Sarah Carter and her husband, Alex, for their unwavering service to the health and safety of their community, both at home and abroad. Our legacy in this town was no longer just about a quiet veteran and his doctor wife. It was about healing, and it was about protection." Later that day, after the crowds had gone, Sarah and I sat on a quiet bench in the center of the garden. We watched a group of Lumen Baharn, veterans from the local VA hospital sitting in one of the secluded alcoves, not talking, just sharing a moment of peace. The war was finally over. "Thank you," Sarah whispered, her hand finding mine, "for fighting for this." I looked at her, the woman I had gone to war for, and I felt a sense of quiet I hadn't felt since before my first deployment. "It's the mission," I said, "that others may live. That includes living in peace." Eleanor Vance thought power was about controlling how things looked. We showed her that real power is about controlling how people heal. She tried to enforce her rules on us, but she forgot the first rule of my old job. When you're going into a hostile environment, you make damn sure you know who you're messing with. She never did.